The video I'm about to share is a more in-depth discussion with one of our panelists, Kathryn Welby. Kathryn is an assistant professor of practice, education, and community studies at Merrimack College in New England. In this video, you'll discover more about Kathryn's book on how technology during COVID has helped children with learning challenges. You'll find out how she got started with the research, about how children with special needs not just survived but thrived in school, and what's next with technology and remote learning. We hope you enjoy the interview, and please follow us on LinkedIn, Twitter, or Facebook. We'd love to hear from you. Hey, Kathryn, I'd like to introduce you to our viewers today. Kathryn was kind enough to participate in the recent BigBlueButton World Conference and has a fascinating perspective on the role of technology in assisting children with learning challenges. So I'll start by introducing Kathryn. Kathryn is an assistant professor of practice, education, and community studies at Merrimack College, which is located just outside of Boston, Massachusetts. Kathryn holds Massachusetts licensures as a special education administrator, principal, moderate disabilities teacher, and elementary education teacher, and recently published a book titled Remote Learning Strategies for Students with IEPs, an Educator's Guidebook. So Kathryn, again, thank you so much for taking some time to chat.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you for having me. I'm excited.
Me too. As the father of somebody with the children with an IEP and with learning difficulties, your discussion at the conference was really poignant for me, because I think it gives hope. Because of course, you know, there's no escaping the reality that technology is going to play an increasing role going forward in education. And I know that overnight, because of COVID, you know, 1 billion children were immediately moved out of the classroom and had to rely on this interface. But the potential of technology, if we stop thinking about it, is just a window that connects the student to the teacher, and start thinking about the potential in all its forms, technology can be really incredible, I think. Particularly for kids. I know that my child, if they could be more exploratory and not follow the traditional education model, would benefit a lot from education. So what I'm curious about, I know that you spent 15 years teaching and then you got into kind of hardcore academia. Can you tell us a bit more about your background in this area? What led you to particularly focus on studying the role of technology with children in this category, and specifically, what kind of insights were you hoping to uncover, and were there any surprises?
Well, I spent 15 years as a special education teacher, and my transition to higher ed was more of as a special education professor. And then this happened, you know, the remote learning happened. So it was one of those very organic, unintentional research projects that started because of the pandemic. So as the special ed professor, I was asked to put together some type of professional development for our partnership school districts to help them with remote learning. So I'm like, not a problem, 15 minutes professional development, I can do that. And then as I started to create this professional development for remote learning, I realized that I have never done that before. I have never taught children with disabilities remotely. So I reached out to a handful of educators that are working in the field. And I said, you know, could you please give me a few strategies? To make it easy, I'm going to send out a Google Doc and just, you know, Google form, just fill it out and tell me a strategy or two that is working for teaching children with disabilities on IEPs. And an IEP is an individual education program in the United States. It's just a student that has a disability would have an IEP. And tell me an idea or a strategy that worked and pass it on to somebody else you know. So at this point, it wasn't formalized research. It was just anecdotal. What can we do to help these teachers? So this was passed on, and within 5 days, I had almost 100 responses on what would work, what's working for children with disabilities. So it wasn't really, I wasn't trying to sugarcoat the struggle, but I was trying to find all the success stories that emerged from the struggle. So within those 5 days, my next step was, okay, well, now I can put together this quick little professional development for our partnership schools. And I did that. It was a with our MINTS program. It's a donor-operated program for professional development for teachers. So I put together this quick professional development, but I also thought with 100 teachers giving me all of these success stories, their voices should be heard. Like, what else can I do to share these successes that it's working for some students? So I wrote an article, a quick article for edtopia.org, which led to a few book offers. But at that point, to actually write the book, which I said no to because I have 3 of my own children, I was struggling with remote learning initially. So in order to actually write the book, I had to formalize the research through the internal review board and surveys. And so that's how the research came about. And from there, I was able to get 257 people across 37 states and 4 countries that were successfully teaching children with disabilities and learning challenges remotely. So,
now, Kathryn, can I ask you? I mean, that's an amazing response that you got, and certainly not. I wouldn't think you would expect that kind of response. Was there something that was triggering people's interest or desire to participate? Was it because they were surprised? Was it because they saw that, like, prompted that response?
I'm not sure, but I feel like educators really came together during this crisis to help each other. And I wonder if it was more of I want to help my colleague. Let me share what's working. Let me tell, let me share that to help people. And I'm not sure. I was very surprised at the response. In fact, I thought I was going to have to pull teeth to find, enough responses and to find out what was working. But it seemed like there was a lot working for people, and people were wanting to share their successes. So I don't know, but I think it was more of the teacher mentality of helping each other out and getting through it.
So were you surprised by what you found?
I was surprised. I was surprised at how much in all the different strategies, resources, tips, tools, and I was surprised at all the different populations of students that were actually thriving from remote learning.
Did you notice, was the surprise that kids were doing well in remote learning, or was the surprise that they were actually benefiting in certain ways? In fact, that the experience of learning was improved because of remote learning? Like, what was it? Just that they were coping, or that they were actually getting a better experience?
Well, I believe there is a certain population of students who are really thriving and benefiting from remote learning. And those students were the students that had emotional, social, behavior disabilities. And also students that were diagnosed with hard of hearing, or deaf students were thriving from remote learning, believe it or not, because when we're talking, everything was transcribed. And they could also engage in chats, and they had more, engagement going on than they would in the classroom, where they were struggling to hear and understand what was going on. And the students that had the disabilities, the social, emotional disabilities, and having remote options takes away all those social anxieties of the school day. Just what do I wear? What do I say? I don't want to do this. I don't want to do that. And you take all that away, and they were thriving. Students that weren't coming to school because they were having anxieties were showing up remotely, and they were doing well. Also students who were in outplacement, around the high school age, they were in collaboratives or outplacement settings, and they were working on life skills. Those students were also thriving because the teacher was actually in their homes, teaching them how to make breakfast, how to clean, how to, rake leaves. And they were talking about all these things that they were learning, not in a lab school in their schools, but actually in their homes. So they could apply their learning immediately to their life. So that population was also thriving. And it'd be nice if there was some type of hybrid between, because these students obviously need the socialization of the school, or some type of socialization. So it would be nice if they could learn remotely, but have some hybrid options to have that socialization in school. So you're not taking that away from them. It's just more of an accommodation. If remote learning could eventually be accommodation for some of these students, I think it would be very helpful.
So does the book become kind of because I remember you said at the outset you were tasked with kind of putting together something to teach, a very quick, almost tutorial for your partner schools. What did the book, because you had that volume of responses, what does the book become? Like, is it? Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to ask, is it an A to Z guide in terms of how to work with kids, or how to encourage kids, or how to get parents involved in the process of work? Like, what is it? What has the book become because there's such a volume of insights?
The book has become, each chapter is kind of laid out asynchronous strategies. How can you learn asynchronously? Synchronous strategies, how to promote parent engagement, tips and tools for parents. How can parents work with their children at home by taking some of the tools and accommodations that we use in the classroom and incorporating them into the house? And so it just kind of brings everything together, and it's more and it's also generalizations. So, for example, the chapter on synchronous learning would be tips, tools, and strategies from success stories from educators in the field. So, what was working for them? So, it's all laid out there what was working. A lot of times, if more than one person said it, it definitely got in the book. If there was a bunch of people were saying the same things. If it was just an outlier, I didn't always add all the outliers, but some success stories were outliers. And it's accumulating. It's like a resource book. So however you want to teach, you can go through and get all these tips, tools, strategies that have worked for teachers. And of course, every student with disabilities and learning challenges learns differently. So it's one of those things you can take, you can try. If it doesn't work, go to the next thing. Try something else, go to the next thing.
Now, I know that obviously COVID created almost the perfect laboratory for this. But it feels to me like, if I understand right, there were a lot of surprising lessons that a lot of people perhaps weren't expecting. And so in a way, being forced into this COVID environment enabled you to see these opportunities that wouldn't perhaps have come through as clearly. So I'm wondering, now as we anticipate going back to school, we're back into the classrooms come the fall, what is the opportunity to build off your book and to actually say, no, we can't lose this opportunity. We've got to take this to another level. Are there opportunities? Are you working with organizations who say, you know what, we want to try experimenting with a different way of teaching?
I think that's inevitable. I think that we cannot go back. I think we were doing it the same way for 50 years. And I think it's time, more than 50 years, I think it's time for some changes, time to incorporate technology into learning, because there were so many students who benefited from it. And whether it's an accommodation on an individual education program, that technology and remote learning or some type of platform should be part of it. I think that we're going to see a lot of changes. Even if you think about group work inside the classroom, you could be using a platform inside the classroom with people and across the country. I mean, there's so many options that you could do going forward. And those students who benefited, for example, I know I'm going, here and there, but even the ones, the deaf and hard of hearing, this would be perfect in the classroom for them. How can we accommodate all of these students and learn what we did in the last 15 months and take it with us into the classroom? I think it's inevitable that this is going to be the future of education. Somehow this is going to be the future. I don't know exactly. I think it's going to be, once we get the evidence base and, we do the research on what works, what doesn't work. I have no doubt that remote learning is going to be part of the future.
So I would imagine that to be a special education teacher probably puts you in a pretty creative class of teachers, because you, as you say, if you're dealing with a group of students that have special needs, every one of them is different. You can't count on, I don't think teaching at any levels is easy by any respect, but I would imagine that if you're in a special ed situation, that you've got to be somebody that is the Swiss Army knife of teachers. You've got to try and figure out and constantly be creative. And I'm wondering, I guess in a way, it's no surprise that you got that response if you've got people whose natural instinct is to constantly try and find ways to improve the experience of the student. But I'm curious, what were your experiences or observations in terms of how parents responded over the last 15 months. Did you find that parents embraced the role of technology, saw the opportunity in technology, and supported the role of technology?
I do. I think at first everyone it was a hard experiment for parents, figuring out how to help and assist and support their child while they're learning from home. And I think if we didn't have technology, it would have been a lot more difficult for parents to do that. I was thinking about this quote from Dr. Stephen Shore. He said, "Once you've met one child with autism, you've met one child with autism." And I was thinking about what you said, and I'm thinking, you know what? That's true with every disability and learning challenge. What works for one student doesn't always work for another student. And it's that trial and error and relationship building that's just so important. And I think remote learning has taught us that. We got to figure out what works for each individual student and go from there. So what you said just made me think about that with that quote, and then bringing the parents in. I think that it has helped them, because if you think about special education, we would use people to transcribe, if you needed a scribe, a note taker, somebody read a story. We would rely on the parents to do all of those things. Now technology can do those with assistive communication devices, with transcribing conversations, text-to-speech software. That's all making the life of a child with a disability easier.
Right. Do you know, I interviewed our keynote
for the first day of the conference. I interviewed him earlier. A fellow by the name of Scott McLeod. I don't know if you know him or have heard of him, but he is a specialist in leadership and technology around education. So he's a professor at the University of Colorado, Denver, and this is his specialization, is to look at how you prepare teachers and schools to better use technology. And it was interesting. It kind of dawned on me speaking to him was that, on if I wear my parent hat, one of the things that you try and discourage your kids from is spending too much screen time. And what he was saying is that the problem with, or he wasn't saying the problem, he said that what we're experiencing now is the tip of the iceberg. Like what we're doing right now is the tip of the iceberg. This is simply an interface. And while a lot of parents want to discourage their children from kind of passively consuming content, the reality is that the role of technology in terms of some of the things you touched on, connecting or being able to absorb or communicate differently depending on their challenges, or to be self-directed, to basically do project-based learning and to use this incredible tool that opens the world for us. Really the potential is endless. And I think, one of the challenges that struck me is, because he talked about this, he said, there is a professional, the exact term he uses, like there's a kind of a professional class of student, right? These kids grow up in a certain home. They know how to play the school game. Like they know they can sit there, they can read, they can do the test, they can do all this stuff. But there's a whole lot of other kids out there that don't operate that way. And I was recounting a story myself where I had taught, a business program in a relatively rich school and a relatively poor school. And it was amazing the difference in the students. The rich kids were, the children of lawyers, doctors. These were professional students. They showed up, they were on time, well prepared, knew the drill. The kids that came from the poor school, they were not. They had amazing lateral thinking skills, though, compared to the other kids. They were much more adaptive. And one of the things that I'm really fascinated by is this idea that if you've got a group of special needs kids where every one of them is different, and that's a great quote, if you meet one autistic kid, you've met one autistic kid. I also think the fact that this is a massive enhancement to the classroom, that can take kids in directions and allow them to explore information and content in a way they simply can't get in a classroom. So it's not simply a kind of a more innovative interface that's right for certain kinds of kids. It's just a powerful learning tool. And I wonder if in that research, I know it's only a 15-month window or 12-month window, whatever. I'm wondering, did you find that the learning outcomes improved? Like I know that some of these issues, anxiety levels or being able to communicate in a notice that kids were more engaged, that they were actually taking
A lot more and enjoying the experience more. Did you notice any of that?
For certain populations, I did. And for others, like for example, I think they were enjoying it more because I feel like there was more connection sometimes, not all the time. I feel like you need that face-to-face connection, but I feel like you're in each other's homes, and I feel like there was that connection there, um, to learn from each other and about each other a little bit more. Even the teachers were saying that they learned um, from their students. They saw their house, they saw where they were living. They felt more of a connection with their students.
Hmm.
Um, but the learning outcomes, I never got to that part yet because it's only been a 15-month study. But I will say a lot of people did say that there was higher graduation rates for students who didn't typically were at risk of not graduating, because once they offer the remote option, they would show up more frequently. So in some schools, especially the Outplacement Collaborative, said that the graduation rate had increased that year of remote learning because their attendance was there. So although I don't have the learning outcomes yet, and there's so many more studies that need to come about for this, especially the learning outcomes, some data from the learning. But I will say that was reported that the graduation rates have increased. So I think that's a win for an option for remote learning.
Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it? I've taught at university level, so I haven't taught in what I would think of as the kind of the trenches the way that you've taught. But I've done the odd course at a high school, but what amazes me is that there are so many kids with the potential to be left behind. And if we don't get these things right, they have no future. And so it is so important. I mean, that research you did is so profoundly important, I think, for kids in this condition.
And I think it's what is going to get each individual student to the next level. Is it having an option to learn remotely? Is that going to help student A get to graduate, move on with their life? What do we need to do? And it's not black and white anymore. It's every student is an individual. So what works for one doesn't always work for the other, but there has to be options for everything in between. And I think remote and the technology that's happening is the options for a lot of students that's in between, that just need a little something else.
Hmm. What are you planning to do next because of this research?
I mean, I would like to continue with it. I'd like to, I know that there are some schools that do have virtual options, and I'd like to find out those schools and work with them. And I'd like to find some outcomes. What are some outcomes versus the students that are in school? I'd like to do a comparison study, which would be nice to do. First of all, I need to find those schools that have continued, the districts that have that option of the virtual schooling, and figure out what is still working. And like I said, I created this book to help teachers know what to do tomorrow. Just let's give them, they're stuck in this pandemic. There was a panic mode from our partnership schools. What do we do? What do we do? What do we do? So the intent of the research was, let me help teachers tomorrow. Let me figure out what they can do tomorrow right away. But there's so much more that has to be done in this work. And I think I would love others to participate in this. And I think that, what is the data showing? Let's do some comparative data. Is it the same? Is it different? What's next? And I think this is going to be next. I think a piece of this will be next. It's just whether it's a hybrid type for some populations, I'm not sure the next, but there's definitely going to be something big that comes about from this.
Oh, I think for sure, and you're so well positioned because of the research, and because of those connections. I'm wondering if were there any success stories that really jumped out from what you heard?
I mean, in speaking in general terms, there was a lot of part of an IEP would be the speech therapy, the language therapy, the occupational therapy. That's part of the individual education program of students with disabilities. And a lot of times, students that have diagnosed disabilities are overscheduled with all of these therapies. And I've noticed with the remote option that they were co-treating students, meaning rather than like 3 times 15, 3 times a week, 15 minutes each, they condensed their treatments and had, an hour treatment. They would all work together and they would work. And sometimes the parent was able to attend because only an hour versus, scheduled time throughout the day, but they would create a lesson, whether it was a remote board game. And, they all play the board game together and they incorporate OT, PT, they would roll the virtual die, go 5 steps. They would have to, write their name from the occupational therapist, write your name. They roll the die, another 2, walk up and down a flight of stairs. So they're all incorporating their services, but they're doing it in a way together rather than over scheduling students. And with only an hour block a week, parents could be more involved and participate in those therapies. So that was a success. A lot of the service delivery worked together to create lessons for students rather than over scheduling. The students that were, like I said, students that were in danger of not graduating were graduating. That was another success. The life skills instruction with a real life application, having that remotely. The increase of classroom engagement because students can chat if they didn't want to speak. They had the chat option of chatting and that helped some of the shyer students with more anxieties to actually participate in classrooms. I would also say the ease of virtual meetings. Parents don't have to take a half day of work. They can come in and have a meeting with the teachers or the team of therapists. That seemed to be another success of remote learning. So all these little successes, there's individual success stories to go along with all this, but there's quite a few different ones, and that kind of packages up into generalizations of some of the successes that I saw.
So my last is this: what would your advice be for teachers
in terms of how they can improve the experience and outcomes for students with these challenges?
Communication is key. Teachers and parents need to communicate weekly so there's no surprises and to figure out what's working, what's not working. And it doesn't have to be a scheduled meeting because I know that sometimes it's difficult for time's sake for parents and teachers to figure that out. But it could be something like a communication journal or even a Google Doc where they're writing at their own time where they can reference it whenever they want. But communication, what's working? Maybe weekly goals. And also routines. Stick with routines. Although if you are learning remotely, that's different. Have a set schedule and a set routine with breaks. Just have it all scheduled in the day. Disorganization creates chaos. Routines are comfort for children, especially children with disabilities and learning challenges. But teaching children with disabilities and learning challenges is tough. It relies on trial and error. So many attempts at figuring things out will fail, but keep trying, be consistent, try the next thing. And it's about trial and error. So once you find successes, embrace those successes and go from there because it's going to be trial and error. And that's teaching children with disabilities and learning challenges. It's trial and error until you build that relationship and figure out what works. And once you figure out what works, there's a light that goes off. And you go from there. So I think my biggest advice is don't give up. Keep trying. And once you figure it out, be consistent. Have routines, communicate, and celebrate successes.
That's great advice. Listen, Kathy, I really do appreciate it. Again, we all do. Your insights are really invaluable. And I think for both parents and teachers, this book is a must read. So thank you again for taking the time. And I wish you all the success with the new school year.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.